Hello and salaam alaikum everyone. Today I wanted to do a video that I've been meaning to do for a little while, but I've been a little bit busy. But I do have an opportunity to get it done today, so I wanted to to sit with you and share with you this video. Inshallah, I hope that everyone is well and are enjoying their holidays, and I hope that inshallah, or God willing, that this video, if you get a chance to listen to it from beginning to end, is a benefit for you. This video will be on the Quranic story of Ibrahim alayhi salam. However, before I go into his story, it's a rather small story from the catalog of stories that there is of Ibrahim alayhi salam in the Quran. But there are things that I want to talk about before even talking about the story, because I want to convey to you certain key points that that eventually will flesh out the various meanings and spiritual elements of the story that's important to keep in mind as someone who either believes in God or certainly believes in the Quran or follows the Muslim religion, regardless of what Islamic sect that you're from. As the elements of this story is cross-reaching and has general meanings that everyone can relate to on a spiritual level. Since we are talking about Ibrahim alayhi salam, I first like to begin by saying Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, in the name of God, most gracious, most merciful. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. I seek refuge from shaitan, the evil one. Ibrahim, just a little bit about his background. He is actually, it is said that he was born in 1813 BCE. So 1813 BCE. And of course, he lived 169 years old. He died in 1644 BCE, and Ibrahim was known as the friend of Allah, or the friend of God. And in Arabic, this reference is referred to as Khalilullah. Khalilullah. Ibrahim had more than one wife. Hajar and Sarah were his spouses. And of course, he had many children. Some of the well-known, of course, is Ishmael and Isaac, or Ismail and Ishaq, depending on whether you're using the Arabic or English. And of course, he had many more sons than that. There have been some descriptions about Ibrahim beyond the Khalilullah epithet. He is known as, or he's been referred to in the Quran as Hanif. Now, the definition of a Hanif is basically is the quality of devotion, or someone who is submissive to God, someone who is considered upright, obedient, and isn't an idolater or someone who doesn't believe in God. So, of course, idolater being someone who doesn't believe that God is more than one, or or in some God that is other than the one true God. But it also has the quality of denoting this idea of Tawheed. And of course, Tawheed is a concept within Islam that refers to the unity of all of life, all of creation, as being deriving from one specific source. And of course, in this case, God. It oftentimes is referred to as the monotheistic belief, right? So these are the elements that make up the definition of someone who is a Hanif. Now, although in the Quran, it's sometimes used to refer to Ibrahim al-Islam, it is not necessarily specific only to Ibrahim. It's actually in itself a concept that can be applied to anyone who is upright, obedient, and is devoted to the belief in the one true God. And of course, we have instances or examples of this in the Quran, where we see the Quran in chapter 22, verse 30 to 31, where God says, but shun the abomination of idols, and shun the word that is false, being upright or hanif for Allah or for God, not associating anything with him, and whoever associates with Allah, okay? So we have this clear statement in the Quran where we see that all these ideas of believing in idols, shunning the false word, meaning anything other than what God has revealed, being upright for God, these are the elements of what constitutes the Hanif, and it's not necessarily related to Ibrahim al-Islam, although in the Quran it is being used at times to refer to him as well. So that's the first and most important point to keep in mind. What's interesting though is that the opposite of Hanif is someone who does not believe, and more specific is someone who puts themselves in the wrong and persists in the wrong. Okay. We see this phrase, someone who puts him or herself in the wrong, expressed, of course, in the Quran. For instance, we have chapter 15, verse 42, in which the Quran says, for over my servants no authority shalt thou have except as such a one who puts themselves in the wrong and follow thee. Now, of course, this verse that I just read is in reference to it's a verse in reference to speaking to Shaitan, right? And of course, we've talked about Shaitan. In my previous videos, if you have a chance, you can look back into those videos. I made a specific video in reference to him as an individual within the Quran. I talked about who he was, his race, his names, and his role within the whole matrix of life. So, but just for you to understand, Shaitan is just an Arabic word that refers to Satan, and it's in reference to, yes, the evil element that can misguide men, that is part of the jinn race. And you can go back to those videos and sort of listen to that discussion and learn a bit more about who he is and who his tribe is, etc., etc. But this verse is talking to him. But what it does say is it talks about those who put themselves in the wrong and follow thee, right? And this following thee is really a persistent wrongdoing, really, essentially is what it is. And of course, this is best illustrated in chapter 15:42, where of course God says, then seest thou such a one as takes his caprice as his God. Allah has known him as such, left him astray, and sealed his hearing and his heart. Heart, of course, in this context means, it includes the spiritual heart, but it also means one's essential understanding of things. And put a cover over his sight. Who then will guide him after Allah has withdrawn guidance? Okay, so when we're talking about those who put themselves in the wrong, this verse illustrates who are those who put themselves in the wrong. And essentially what this verse is answering is that, well, it's those who take on, who believes in themselves only, as opposed to any other power other than themselves. And what that means when we talk about those who believe only in themselves, essentially what it means are those who follow their own vain desires. Okay. Now in this verse, it's translated as caprice, right? And this caprice essentially means, one's own passions, one's own lusts, one's own ideas of things, essentially one's own understanding of things. And as of course a result, God says that when a human being behaves this way in the sight of God, God says, well, what we do is he says, well, this is a form of straying. Okay? This is a form of straying. And the result of this is that God says he leaves these people, be they male or female, alone. And this state of being left alone is a state of being led astray. And this being led astray is highly characterized by the hearing being sealed, the heart being deprived of any deep wisdom and understanding about the realities of life. Okay? And God says, after I've left people in this condition, there's really who will guide him after Allah has withdrawn guidance from this person. There's no opportunity for this person to be led into any kind of right ideas about things when it comes to God anyways. Interestingly enough, in the study Quran, which was produced by Hussein Nasser, the way Hussein Nasser translates this word caprice, he says it entails, he says that it actually comes from a verb. And the verb, it has two verbs actually, hawa and yawi. Now, which means, hawa in the case means to blow, or yawi, which means to fall or to tumble. Okay, so he says that this word caprice really has a deeper meaning, and it exhibits or denotes this notion of to fall or to tumble. And so he concludes that essentially what this verse is saying is that caprice is a condition that leads to being, as it were, as if one is being blown, okay, as if the soul is being blown one way or another, or overthrown, or to tumble one way or another through the calamities of this world, because people are relying on this self that is based on essentially caprice, lust, passion, various desires that they may have. Okay. Essentially, what happens then is the Quran conveys, based on this meaning, the Quran conveys this notion of instability at the level of the soul for people who are relying on themselves to navigate themselves through this life. Now, what's interesting as well, that the verb also includes the notion of being overthrown, right? Of course, to be tumbled, right? To tumble and to be overthrown. Now, this condition of being tumbled or being overthrown, it's not what needs to be understood. It's actually a state of instability, and it's a state of it's an ontological state. It's a state of being. It's not merely just an emotion or that comes or that stays one moment and leaves the next. It's a pervasive condition of being. And it's oftentimes alluded to in other parts in the Quran in other ways. So for instance, in other verses, it's alluded to as fear and grief, right? As in chapter 2, verse 38, where God says, when addressing Adam and Eve, he says, "Get ye down all from here, and if as is sure there comes to you guidance from me, whoever follows my guidance, on them shall be no fear, nor shall they grieve." What's important here is to keep in mind that God is saying that whoever follows my guidance, on them shall be no fear, nor shall they grieve. In other words, the ontological condition of a human being outside of the context of guidance is a persistent and ubiquitous state of fear and grief. This is their ontological condition. And it's not a passing state of mind or emotion. It's a constant, it's a deep-rooted, deep-seated state of loneliness, grief, misery, and fear. This is what the Quran is suggesting. Now, it is also expressed in other aspects, in other parts of the Quran, like for instance, chapter 7:19, that this state of fear, or this ontological condition of grief, is actually considered a state of injustice. And the Quran talks about this. He says, "But do not go near this tree, for then you will be of the unjust." Now, of course, the Quran, this verse is also referring or speaking to Adam and Eve when it tells them, don't go near to this tree. This tree is not something you should be eaten from. And it talks about it. If you go into that, if you abandon the guidance that's being offered to you here, the opposite of which is eaten from this tree, then you would then fall into this condition of misguidance. This condition in which there's a context of fear and grief. And as well, it's an unjust state of being. Okay, it's like a self-inflicted injustice that you do to yourself if you abandon the guidance that's being offered to you. Right? So it says, "But do not go near this tree, for then you will be of the unjust." Okay? But what's important to keep in mind is that although there is this ubiquitous and perennial, persistent ontological state that is part of the state of a human being when they are in the condition of disbelief or unbelief or the rejection of God or the rejection of God's revelation, that it's not the same thing as someone who believes but may, for instance, commit an act of wrongdoing or commit a minor sin. Sins don't necessarily lead one per se into this condition, this ontological condition. And we know this because the Quran is very clear about this. So for instance, putting oneself in the wrong does not necessarily denote someone who sins or who isn't sinless per se. This is the main point that I'm really trying to make. And we know this because the Quran says in chapter 53:32, and God is addressing the Muslims in this particular case. He says, "Those who avoid great sins and shameful deeds, only falling into small faults, verily, thy Lord is ample in forgiveness. He knows best who it is that guards against evil." Okay? So, once again, this guarding against evil, this not putting oneself into the wrong, it has nothing to do necessarily with, making spiritual mistakes, which we aptly refer to as sin. God says here very, very, very emphatically, he says, no, this is not about that. I mean, you can, he says that, yeah, of course, avoid the great sins and shameful deeds. This is what the verse says. It says, but only fallen into small faults. Okay? Verily, your Lord is ample in forgiveness, meaning that God will forgive those small faults. God is not looking for someone who is, who is a saint amongst his servants in general. Of course, I mean, when I say saint, I mean here someone who is just either, as we like to say in Shia Islam, masum, someone who is sinless, or someone who, if we want to use the word saint, someone who is very close to God and most likely don't sin the way the average individual does. So this verse, though, is speaking to the average individual, the average Muslim male and female, the average human being who, yes, they don't fall into major sins. God says that's great. That's God commands that you don't fall into major sins and shameful deeds, and that if you maintain that garden from that, then God says that the small faults God would forgive. Okay? God is ample in forgiveness. It's not an issue, right? So we're not talking about sinlessness here. This is not what guarding or keeping oneself out of the wrong means. Keeping oneself out of the state of wrong or guarding oneself from that means not allowing yourself to be persistent in wrongdoing and disbelief, okay, or persistent in that which is forbidden by God. Chapter 7, verse 176 in the Quran, God says, if it had been our will, we should have elevated him with our signs. But he inclined to earth, or to the earth, and followed his own vain desires. Once again, caprice. His similitude is that of a dog. If you attack him, he lows out his tongue, or if you leave him alone, he still lows out his tongue. That is the similitude of those who reject our signs. Now, here what God is saying is using this metaphor or analogy to illustrate the type of person whom God is really talking about when we talk about someone who puts themselves in the wrong and persists in their wrongdoing. Going back, of course, to reference the earlier verse that I'd mentioned to you, in which it's the type of person that doesn't believe in God. He or she only believes in themselves, and as a result, they follow their own desires. They rely only on their own desires. And God says that, and followed his own vain desires. Now, what's interesting about this particular example in the Quran, God is saying here, we wanted to guide this individual. And this is not only a specific individual. This example is talking about, there are many cases like this throughout humanity, human evolution, from beginning to the end of time, where God is trying to guide certain people, but they either reject him, or they turn from him, or they reject his signs, meaning his revelations. And God says that we would have guided this type of person, but they followed their own vain desires. And then God says that his similitude, or his example, the best comparison we can make for him, or this type of person, right, is that of a dog, where if you attempt to attack it or approach it, or in this case, you attempt to give it guidance to warn it, right, it would read it, and it would still behave dumb, right? And it says that this is the action of a dog. Whether you try to attack it or approach it in any way, it lolls out its tongue, right, at you. And if you leave it alone, in the case of if you withdraw your guidance from this person, they still don't understand. It's like a dog who, if you also leave it alone, they still loll out their tongue. So it's like it's a waste of time with this type of person. This is exactly what God is saying. Their nature, they're rejecting God and reliance on the self, their own vain desires has changed their nature so much that God says that whether I try to reach out to them by way of guidance or I leave them alone in their state of misguidance, they're the same way. And this is like a dog who, if you approach him or you leave him alone, he still is the way he is. He's a dog. You can't change him. And this is a very powerful point that God is trying to make, is that God says that people who rely on them, their own vain desires and belief, even God himself can't come and guide them anymore, because their natures change so much that it's stuck. It's stuck in a certain way. And this is the most dangerous spiritual condition you can ever be in. And of course, there is some hope for that, because God says that in the Quran that, God will not change the condition of a people until they first change what is in their own heart or in their own selves. Of course, this of course means that if anyone who comes to God will come to God having to recognize that, they have to change, or they need to change, and they need to do certain things in order to change. That's the only time that God will initiate the change that God can initiate within a person who is even like that. But what's interesting is there is a danger within this metaphor, because what the metaphor also signifies is that, much like a dog, a dog can't be anything other than what it is. So it's important. One of the important things that this metaphor is also teaching us is that it's not a condition where you want to end up being, because you can end up being stuck, right? Just like a dog can't really change themselves. They're just stuck. And perhaps even more importantly, God says that this comes about as a result of God having tried with you, having tried to reach out to you, having tried to inspire you, having tried to show you through his revelations, having sent people in your life to motivate you to in the various ways that God tries to guide people, right? That after a point, God says that, well, we leave this person alone, and in being left alone, they're stuck, and there's nothing you can do for them. They're like a dog now. Okay. Anyhow, I want to, because I want to make these videos in half-an-hour clips only. That way a person can, if after half an hour they're interested in learning more about what I'm talking about, they can move on to the next clip. It's now coming to the half-an-hour point. Excuse me. So if you want to continue with this discussion in part 2, see the other video that I will make, and we will continue with the discussion. Assalamu alaikum and bye for now.